Tippu was an engaging and intriguing character in himself. He was principally an ivory trader but, like most wealthy Arabs of this period, bought, sold, and owned slaves. In the course of his journeying through East and Central Africa, he met and at times collaborated with the famous European discoverers and explorers of Africa, including Livingstone, Stanley, Cameron, and Wisman. It has been said that Tippu even played his part in the process which has come to be known as the Scramble for Africa. At one time actually accepting a position in the employment of Leopold II, King of the Belgians and Butcher of the Congo. Tippu, one of several nicknames he earned in adulthood, was born probably in 1837, in Zanzibar, as Haim bin Muhammad al-Murjabi. His father was a traveling trader, and from his youth he became involved in trading on the East African mainland. His life may be divided, for convenience, into 5 journeys, although some of these were so long that they might be more accurately thought of as absences from Zanzibar, his hometown. To begin with, he traveled to areas south and southwest of Lake Tanganyika, but then progressively moved north, setting up his base at Kasongo, on the Lualaba River, which, as we shall see, was later found to be the upper part of the River Congo. All these journeys, except the last, were primarily devoted to the collection of ivory and its transportation back to the coast in huge caravans of free and slave porters. He may have traded in other goods, but there is no record of him having done so. On the way to gathering his very valuable stocks of ivory, he asserted personal power and authority over numerous villages and tribes over a vast area in East and Central Africa, mostly through violent conquest. He has been described as an emperor, but the extent of his authority varied. In some places he practiced rulership, in the sense of settling disputes and ensuring peace and stability, sometimes through a deputy, while in others his influence was felt only when he was personally present. In his early journeys, Tippu came into contact with various Europeans traveling in the region, notably Henry Morton Stanley. His 5th journey differed from the others because of its having been planned and implemented, in a contractual collaboration with Stanley, as the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition of 1887 to 1889. With Stanley, Tippu traveled up the Congo River and based himself at Kisangani, an island on the Congo River right beside the Belgian station of Stanley Falls. By this stage, through Stanley's mediation, he had been in contact with King Leopold II, and been appointed by him as governor of the eastern part of what by then was the Congo Free State, based at Stanley Falls. At first glance, this seems an improbable arrangement, from both of their points of view. But it suited the king, and it may have been Tippu's high point. His influence and authority were then at their zenith, and he accumulated vast stocks of ivory. When he returned to Zanzibar in 1890, he found himself involved in court cases, mainly one brought by Stanley over interpretation of the contract made at the start of the Emin Pasha expedition, and he had to watch from the sidelines as the Arabs in his former stomping grounds west of Lake Tanganyika were ousted by the Belgians, and his son Sef, or Sefu, whom he had left in command at Kisangani, was killed in battle. Although much had been lost, he retained wealth, including estates, in Zanzibar, and died there in June 1905, aged probably 68. The characters involved in the intriguing tale of Tippu include Arabs, Africans of the coast and the interior, and Europeans, all living in an environment where nature was often hostile, and sadly, men and women were also often equally so. East Africa had been an area of interest to Arab traders from early times. But in the 19th century they came to realize the great profits that could be made from ivory. It was a product of little interest to the Africans of the interior, but valued both in India and increasingly in Western Europe and America. Some stocks of ivory were exported to India and worked there into items for re-export to European, American and even Chinese markets. As the Omani ruler Said bin Sultan built up his control of Zanzibar and the coast in the first half of the 19th century, Arab traders developed the exploitation of ivory for export to those markets. Tippu was foremost among such traders. The Arabs found that, As supplies of ivory became exhausted in the coastal areas, they could move farther west to find new supplies, and they established trading centers on the shores of Lake Tanganyika and on the trading routes between there and the coast. They then crossed Lake Tanganyika, traveled through the dense rainforest of what is now eastern Congo, and made settlements on rivers such as the Lomami and the Lualaba. Their methods of acquiring the ivory became more violent as they moved farther west, inspiring fear and strong opposition from African tribespeople living in villages in the area. But they managed to export huge quantities, most of it still through the East African port of Bagamoyo and the market in Zanzibar, and some down the Congo River, as the Belgians developed river transport and communication in the latter decades of the century. The history of the East African slave trade is, not surprisingly, highly contentious. It is accepted that the trade was ancient. 4th century AD sources mention trading of slaves in the Red Sea. There are records in the 9th century of a revolt among black slaves who were draining salt marshes in lower Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, and Ibn Battuta, traveling in the 14th century, mentions slaves in Arab households in Mogadishu and Yemen. By the beginning of the 19th century, African slaves were used mainly in domestic situations. Historians do not know how they were captured and brought to their eventual places of employment in the early period, but sources from the mid-19th century onwards describe how they were taken, often with extreme violence, from villages in the area near Lakes Victoria, Tanganyika and Nyassa, force marched in chains to the coast, and shipped to markets in Zanzibar. Scholars now argue that the nature of the slave trade changed in the early and middle decades of the 19th century. Until then, the wealthy would wish to own slaves as a sign of prestige and for their value in the household, including, of course, as concubines permitted in Islamic teaching. Some were also used on public works projects such as the Mesopotamia salt marsh draining, and a number in agriculture, particularly date palm cultivation. But as Sayyid Said bin Sultan, arguably the greatest of the Al-Busaidi rulers of Muscat and Zanzibar, consolidated his hold on the East African littoral, thus expanding the scope for Omani trade, the nature of commerce in the Indian Ocean changed. Sayyid Said moved his court and his main place of residence from Muscat to Zanzibar in 1839, presumably seeing that his East African possessions were generating higher income than the homeland, and were also less prey to threats from his northern neighbors, the Wahhabis of Central Arabia. Much of the Zanzibari wealth came from plantations, Arab investors having recently discovered that cloves, brought from what is now Indonesia via Réunion and Mauritius, flourished in the soil and climate of Zanzibar. These plantations needed imported labor, and so a different style of slave trading developed. Arab traders were largely responsible. They operated the local slave markets, chiefly the one in Zanzibar, and sailed the dhows that took the slaves to the northern markets in Arabia, Persia, and beyond. While trading east of Lake Tanganyika, they mainly bought, and then sold, slaves who had been captured by one African chief at war with another. Much of this trade was not connected with the commerce in ivory. Slaves were brought to the coastal markets purely for subsequent sale for work domestically or on plantations. It was this trade which so shocked David Livingstone, and then humanitarians such as those in the Anti-Slavery Society. But when the Arabs expanded their presence westwards, from the 1860s on, their methods became much more violent, as they burned villages and took hostages in order to acquire men and women for slavery, as well as ivory. This became well known in Europe, earning the African Arabs an appalling reputation for cruelty and violence. Tippu was inevitably closely associated with this trade. The problem was that, in the latter decades of the 19th century, the trades of ivory and slaves were inextricably intertwined. It was virtually impossible to get ivory to market from the Congo without using slaves. Although Henry Stanley tried to make the point, few purchasers of ivory luxury goods in Europe or North America seem to have been aware of the dreadful human cost of bringing the products to Oxford Street or Fifth Avenue. In some respects, the same may have been true, in the 1890s and early 1900s, of rubber from the Congo, and those riding bicycles or driving cars on Mr. Dunlop's pneumatic tires. Tippu cannot escape censure for his involvement with the purchase and use of slaves for transporting ivory. The record shows that in his early career he hired free labor for his journeys from Zanzibar and Bagamoyo, and on his second journey, made a detour of several hundred miles to hire men in Tabora to carry home his stock of ivory. There is no reason to suppose that he did anything different later on, at least when traveling westwards, there being a thriving market for free men as porters in the coastal towns. However, for the huge caravans required in his later career to take ivory back from Kisangani to Zanzibar, he makes no mention of hiring, and we must assume he would have used slaves. And although there is no record of his selling slaves at the end of the journey, we must assume that he either disposed of them that way, or re-employed them on his spice estates in Zanzibar. There is one further indictment. Despite the agreements that he made with the Belgians in the period before the Arab-Belgian confrontation, Tippu failed to restrain his fellow Arabs from patterns of horrific violence against African villages, the aim of which was the capture of both slaves and ivory. Some history buffs have formed the erroneous impression that Tippu was primarily a slave trader. His main objective was not to engage in the slave trade for profit. Indeed, he could make more money through ivory trading. But like other wealthy Arabs of the time, he owned and used slaves. They were an essential element in the transportation of ivory from the interior to the coast, and for the management of his estates in Zanzibar. The second half of the 19th century was the period when Western European exploration of Africa reached its zenith. Explorers such as Burton, Speke, Livingstone, and Stanley became famous from their extraordinary journeys, and as a result of their books and lecture tours. The public became fascinated by questions such as the long unsolved mystery of the source of the Nile, and moved by the stories of the cruel traffic of slaves across and out of Africa. Tippu met several of the well-known explorers, most of them by coincidence, as they criss-crossed the continent. These included Livingstone, who fell in with Tippu south of Lake Tanganyika, and traveled under his protection for a few weeks in 1867. Verney Cameron, the first European to cross Africa from east to west, whom Tippu guided from his headquarters on the river Lualaba southwest to Katanga, from where Cameron made his way to the coast at Benguela, in present-day Angola. Wisman, the German explorer who crossed Africa in the other direction, and met Tippu in 1883. Other explorers, Becker, Junker, Glierup, and others, also came his way, as did several missionaries who at this time were setting up their stations on and near Lake Tanganyika. But it was with Stanley that Tippu had the strongest working collaboration. With English-speaking audiences, Stanley is best known for his having found Livingstone in 1871, but a few years after that he organized and led a second expedition aimed at completing Livingstone's work of identifying the source of the Nile. This quest ended in his accomplishing an astonishingly arduous crossing of Africa on a journey which he only just survived, and which brought to Europe knowledge of the unexpected course of the Congo River. Tippu traveled with Stanley for nearly 2 months, giving him some protection as his party traveled on foot and by boat down the river Lualaba. They parted before the river bent round to the northwest and then the west, causing Stanley to confirm his supposition that the Lualaba was not in fact the Upper Nile, but the Congo. Tippu's life story was interwoven with the growth of European imperial conquest of Africa, the Scramble as it became known. After his crossing of the continent and the journey on the Great River, completed in August 1877, Stanley leaves our story for a few years. He was engaged by Leopold II, King of the Belgians, in the enterprise of developing the vast area of the Congo Basin as a Belgian colony. Tippu had by this stage established his base at Kasango on the river Lualaba, some 200 kilometers west of Lake Tanganyika. As the Arab traders had pushed westwards, their communications remained with the east coast, and their loyalties continued to be directed to Barhash, Sultan of Zanzibar and son of the great Said bin Sultan. Barhash claimed a kind of sovereignty over the land, or at least over the Arabs living on the land, up to and beyond Lake Tanganyika. Later the ambitions of King Leopold, the claims of the Sultan of Zanzibar, and the imperial aims of the British and the Germans clashed in a succession of struggles that ended with the de facto Belgian, British, German partition of Central and Eastern Africa, the departure of the Arabs, and the loss of the Sultan's power and prestige in all but Zanzibar and its neighboring islands. Tippu was an active participant in this process. We shall see how Barhash, taking account of Tippu's power and prestige, sought to enlist him in order to shore up his own position both east of Lake Tanganyika and in the upper Congo basin, and how King Leopold and Stanley, engaged in their own particular imperialist projects, persuaded Tippu to come in with them, actually appointing him governor in Stanley Falls, a station established by the Belgian administration high on the Congo River. At this point, in 1887, Stanley and Tippu collaborated on an expedition that was unusually risky, even for these two adventurers. The Emin Pasha Relief Expedition was recently covered on this channel. Stanley, having had good experience of Zanzibari recruits on his previous expeditions, contracted Tippu to supply him with porters and fighters for a force that would ascend the River Congo to its most northerly point, and then branch out northeast in order to rescue Emin Pasha, a German appointed in 1878 by Khedive Ismail, ruler of Egypt under Ottoman tutelage, to govern Equatoria, Egypt's most southerly province. Emin Pasha needed rescuing, in the eyes of many in Europe, because he had been pushed south and isolated by the Mahdi's revolt in Sudan. Popular opinion was enlivened to the danger of the revolt after the killing of Gordon in Khartoum in 1885. Tippu accompanied Stanley on his ship from Zanzibar to the mouth of the Congo, and then up the river, but stayed in Stanley Falls or Kasongo while Stanley pushed through almost impenetrable forests to reach Emin Pasha at Lake Albert. The expedition suffered dreadful losses, and afterwards recriminations flew, some directed at Stanley's poor leadership and organization, some at Tippu for his alleged failure to make good on his contract. Arriving back in Zanzibar, using the eastern route past Lake Victoria and then southeast to Bagamoyo, and not the route via the Congo River by which they had come, Stanley sued Tippu over the contract. Eventually, the case was dropped after Stanley had already returned to England, where he needed to defend his behavior and his management of the expedition. Tippu lived on in Zanzibar as sovereignty slipped from the Al Busaidi sultans. In 1890, the British and Germans signed an agreement that divided control of Africa east of Lake Tanganyika into territories that later became, approximately Kenya and Tanzania. The Sultan was left with Zanzibar and its islands, plus a coastal strip 10 kilometers wide, up to Mombasa, and a British protectorate was declared over Zanzibar. Britain intervened in the succession crisis in 1896, in what is sometimes described as the shortest war in history, about 45 minutes long, and more direct control was assumed by the British over much of the Zanzibari administration. By the time of Tippu's death, in 1905, a British official was First Minister, and even took the position of regent when Sayyid Ali bin Hamad succeeded to the throne but was underage. Generally, the problem with historical writings about Tippu is the absence of the African, Arab or Swahili voice. In the case of Tippu, however, we have his own memoirs, probably a unique document of its type. It arose because of a second lawsuit in which Tippu was engaged, in 1894 to 1895, with a fellow Arab, Muhammad bin Khalfan, nicknamed Rumaliza. Because Rumaliza had been living in the German sphere of influence, and was technically a German subject, his defense was assisted by the German consul's legal counselor, Heinrich Brode. Tippu became acquainted with Brode during the court case, and was persuaded by him to write an account of his life, in Swahili though in Arabic script. Brode himself transcribed this into Roman script, and published it. Later, in 1903, he wrote his own biography of Tippu, which draws heavily on the memoirs but obviously also benefits from conversations Brode had with him. Hence, Tippu's story is one based on the written record and not hearsay or the accounts of griots. Thanks for joining us on this historical journey. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more historical accounts.